I've been working as a truck driver for years, and I've been through some strange situations on the road, but nothing close to what happened that night. It was an ordinary morning, another lonely trip through the empty roads of North Carolina. The sound of the engine and the road was the only noise I heard, and the starlight was the only company. I was already at the end of my shift and wanted to get to my stop quickly, but something that night was different. The CB radio, which normally only picked up other drivers' conversations or weather information, started making a strange hiss, something I had never heard before. At first, I thought it was interference, but as I drove, the messages became clearer. At first, it just sounded like a low voice, almost a whisper, that I couldn't understand. I thought it was some lost driver trying to get attention or something. However, the sound became clearer. The voice became more defined, more directed, as if it were speaking directly to me. I started to hear something that sounded like a warning, but I couldn't make out the words. The radio seemed to have a life of its own, and a strange feeling began to invade me. As he continued his journey, the voice was heard again. "Careful, stay alert." I looked around, looking for something that could justify that message. But there was nothing in sight. The road was deserted, as always. Only the truck's headlight illuminated the dark road in front of me. The voice didn't stop. The words became clearer and the instructions more specific. "Slow down, there's something in front of you." I confess that I started to feel uncomfortable, but I tried to remain calm. Truck drivers have to have nerves of steel, right? But then something even more disturbing happened. The voice seemed to know exactly what was going on around me. "Slow down now, the truck in front is stopped." The message was so clear and so precise that my body froze. I was alone on the road, miles away from any town, and yet the voice knew what I was seeing. I looked ahead, trying to see something in the darkness. And that's when my heart stopped. There, in the middle of the road, I saw a truck stopped, without any lights on. He was completely still, as if he was waiting for me. My body immediately filled with a strange feeling, as if I had bumped into something I shouldn't have. I squinted my eyes trying to understand better, but nothing felt right. The truck was in the middle of the road, completely out of place, and there was no sign that it had had any mechanical problems. There were no emergency lights flashing, nothing. Just that dark truck, parked in the darkness. My throat felt dry. I knew something was wrong. I slowed down as the voice on the radio had asked, the sound of the engine fading as I slowly approached. I was about 100 meters away when I realized there was no one inside. The truck was completely empty. There was no one in the cabin, no light, no reflection in the windows. The kind of emptiness that only appears when something isn't exactly what it seems to be. A shiver ran down my spine, and I wanted to turn the key and drive away, but something stopped me. The radio was silent now, but that feeling of being watched made me tense. When I got closer, what disturbed me most was the absolute silence. There were no sounds other than the rumble of my truck, and yet it felt like something else was there, watching. I passed by the truck, staring at it, and even with the headlights illuminating the side of the road, nothing seemed real. The cab was empty, but the truck seemed to follow me with an invisible gaze. Something told me not to continue, not to move forward, but I was paralyzed by the uncertainty of what I could do. Then, before I could make any decisions, the radio crackled again. It was the voice, but now, it was calmer, more, almost friendly, like it was trying to reassure me. "Now you can follow. Don't look back." It was like a whisper in the back of my mind, something that took a weight off my shoulders, but at the same time put me in another kind of mental prison. I kept driving, but that voice, that warning, stuck in my head. I looked in the rearview mirror and for a moment I thought I might have seen something reflected, but I didn't see anything. The road behind me was as empty as before, but something told me that, at that moment, I had already crossed a line I shouldn't have crossed. The voice did not speak again, but the feeling of being watched persisted. I tried to ignore it, telling myself that I was exaggerating, that my body was still reacting to the scare, to what I couldn't explain. But as time passed and the hours dragged by on the deserted road, a growing restlessness took hold of me. I was trying to keep my mind busy, focusing on the road ahead, but every time I glanced at the mirrors, that feeling of something following me seemed to intensify. And then, just like that, the radio crackled again. This time, the voice seemed more urgent. "Speed up. You're close, but time is running out." It was a direct command, which left me confused and at the same time desperate. Why accelerate? What was happening? I tried to ignore it, but it felt like the voice was controlling me somehow, like it knew what I should do. The words didn't make sense, but at the same time, I couldn't shake them away. It was as if something inside me was telling me to obey, without question. As if there was no other choice. I stepped on the accelerator, and the truck picked up speed. The wind that beat against the windows seemed colder, more cutting. I felt the weight of the wheels on the asphalt, but there was also a strange sensation, as if the ground beneath me was no longer the same. What was once a simple, familiar road now seemed like a distorted landscape, a blurred canvas where the lines between the real and the unrecognizable were beginning to blur. The radio was still silent, and for some reason I felt more restless, more out of control. It was then that, on the horizon, a light appeared. A bright light, like a headlight from another truck, but it was so far away that it seemed more like an illusion. I strained my eyes to try and understand what it was, but the glow disappeared as quickly as it came. It was as if he had been swallowed by darkness. My heart pounded in my chest, and for a moment, I was almost consumed by fear. Everything inside me screamed to slow down, to stop. But instead, I sped up even more, as if I was being carried by an invisible force. When the light disappeared, absolute silence took over the road. Nothing seemed real anymore. I no longer knew if I was dreaming or if I was trapped in some living nightmare. The truck seemed to be driving itself, as if I was no longer in control. With each kilometer covered, the feeling that something was about to happen increased. But what? I was already losing my mind was starting to give in to the pressure of not understanding what was happening. I wanted to believe it was just tiredness, but I couldn't. Something wasn't right, and I knew it wasn't all in my head. It was then that the radio crackled again, once again interrupting the silence. "Look ahead," said the voice, with disturbing calm. I looked. And that's when I saw it. The truck in front of me, again. Only this time, he was no longer still. He was moving slowly, as if he was waiting for me. I blinked a few times, thinking my vision was failing, but it wasn't. The truck was there, about 200 meters away, following my path. But what made me freeze was that he was completely out. No headlights, no lights, nothing. A ghost truck, driving down the dark road, guiding me somehow. I didn't know what to do. I was breaking out in a cold sweat, my hands on the steering wheel shaking. The radio crackled once more, and the voice spoke clearly, "Don't overtake him." At that moment, I knew something far beyond my understanding was happening. It was as if everything had been orchestrated to take me there, to that exact moment. I tried to avoid it, but the feeling that something was stopping me, that I shouldn't do this, was too strong. I just continued behind that truck, following it down the deserted road. I could never explain what happened after that. I followed the road, and eventually the truck in front of me faded away, disappearing without a trace. When I arrived at my destination, it was already dawn, and I was exhausted, both physically and mentally. The radio was silent, as if it had never spoken to me. The truck never showed up again. To this day, I don't know what happened. Whether it was an illusion, whether my mind was in a tailspin from exhaustion, or whether there was something more, something I will never understand. But one thing is certain, that night will haunt me forever. I was in the middle of a long drive, crossing a remote country road in Wyoming, when I saw the gas station in the distance. I wasn't planning on stopping, but something that night made me change my mind. The place was isolated, with not a soul in sight, and the only visible light was that of my truck illuminating the contours of a dilapidated building. There was a sense of desolation that hung in the air, something that made me hesitate for a moment, but I was too tired to pay much attention to it. I just needed a little rest before continuing. When I entered, the place was quiet, with a heavy smell of mold and dust. The walls were covered in old photos of truck drivers and events that seemed to have happened there decades ago. The floor was covered in a thick layer of dust, and the shelves were practically empty except for a few old and broken objects. What caught my attention the most was the security box that was locked on a table. She seemed out of place, like she was waiting for me. My curiosity was greater than my fear, so I went there and tried to open it. The key was nearby, inside a drawer that was also abandoned, as if someone had suddenly left everything behind. I looked around, but there was no one, just the muffled silence of that forgotten place. When I managed to open the box, what I found immediately gave me goosebumps. Inside was a pile of letters, records and documents that had yellowed with the passage of time. The first thing that caught my attention was a farewell letter, written by someone with shaky handwriting, saying that he was leaving, but that he would never return to that position. And at the bottom, something even stranger, the name of a missing truck driver. I didn't understand it at first, but as I flipped through the pages, something seemed more and more familiar. Some of the names on the letters were marked with circles, as if the owner of the box had taken an interest in those cases. It was then that, as I turned a page, I found something that made me stop. The name of the most recent missing truck driver was there, and next to it, my name. The same name that was on my driver's license. I froze. How was this possible? I looked at the box again, and then I realized that all those disappearances were somehow connected to that gas station. The feeling of cold that took over me was instantaneous. I looked at my name there, so clearly written, and for a moment, I didn't know what to do. I was starting to feel dizzy, like the air around me was thicker, heavier. I tried to rationalize, but more and more, it felt like something was closing around me, like an invisible trap. What did that post have to do with all those disappearances? Why was my name there, among so many others of drivers who were never found? I started looking for more information, turning the pages in a hurry. There were records of missing truck drivers on the same road I was on, and they were all there, in the photos and letters. Some had disappearance dates that coincided with my past trips. But the strangest thing was that, in the letters, everyone talked about the feeling of being followed. They mentioned a feeling of not being alone, of something watching them on the deserted roads. I felt a lump in my throat, something tightening my chest. I knew I was in danger. Something inside me said to get out of there as quickly as possible. But before I could get up, a photo on the wall caught my eye. It was a photo of a truck driver with a blank look, as if he was lost, surrounded by other drivers and some people who seemed to be at the station. What worried me most was the date on the back of the photo, which indicated that it had been taken on the same day that the truck driver disappeared. He seemed to be looking at something behind the camera, something no one else seemed to notice. I started to feel more and more out of place. The air was too heavy, and I couldn't breathe properly. Something wasn't right. I needed to leave. The feeling of being watched, something I had ignored at first, was now impossible to shake. I turned around and, looking out the broken window, saw the light of another truck in the distance, stopped on the road. The light was so far away, but it still seemed to watch me. My body felt cold. The radio, which had been off the entire time, began to emit a low hiss, as if something was trying to speak. I couldn't make out the words, but the sound was enough to send me into a panic. I knew this wasn't normal. It wasn't just tiredness. I was being pulled into something I couldn't understand. The pressure in my chest was becoming unbearable. I needed to get out of there, and quickly. But when I got up, something paralyzed me. The security box, which was open in front of me, was pushed by a draft that seemed to come from inside the station. The cards began to move on their own, as if they were being pulled by an invisible force. I tried to ignore it, but the pages started coming towards me, spreading across the floor, forming a path that led me to the front door. I don't know why, but something forced me to follow this path. When I got to the door, I noticed that the truck that was outside was no longer on the road. There was nothing left but darkness. But it was then that a figure appeared in my peripheral vision. It was in the corner of the broken window, a dark silhouette, without a defined shape, as if it were watching from the other side. I tried to scream, but my voice felt trapped, like I was drowning somewhere inside. The figure didn't move, but somehow I knew it saw me. I knew I couldn't leave. I was pulled back inside, as if a force was forcing me to sit down, and the radio, which had been silent until that moment, made a loud crack, breaking the silence with a low, drawling voice. "You can't leave. Not now. The post isn't done with you yet." I couldn't reason anymore. Panic took over me so overwhelmingly that I could barely breathe. I didn't know what was real anymore. I looked at the door once again, and there was the silhouette, now closer, the contours defining themselves like a shadow that seemed to grow. It was then that the lights on the road, which I had seen earlier, returned. It was no longer a truck. It was a row of headlights that were quickly approaching, but the vehicles were nowhere in sight. Only the headlights illuminated the darkness, as if invisible trucks were arriving to take me away. I couldn't stay there any longer. The last thing I remember was throwing myself out of the gas station and running down the road without looking back. The lights disappeared as soon as I stepped onto the asphalt, and I headed towards freedom, but not without a feeling that this road was not over for me. Something was still watching me. I was driving down a mountain road, one of those long, winding roads in rural Colorado, late at night. The sound of the truck's engine was the only thing that broke the silence, and the sharp curves and the deep darkness on the sides of the road gave me a feeling of loneliness, as if the world had disappeared. It wasn't the first time I'd taken this route, but that night something was different. I started to notice a light in my rear-view mirrors. At first, I thought it was just another driver, maybe someone going in the same direction. But the light never went out. She was always there, right behind me. I looked in the rearview mirror again and saw the car getting a little closer. It sent a chill down my spine. Normally, on those roads, drivers tend to overtake if the speed is slower, but the car wasn't doing that. He simply stayed there, at the same distance, without ever overtaking. I accelerated a little, trying to increase the distance, but, strangely, the car did the same. I went faster, took some sharp turns, but every time I looked in the rearview mirror, the light was there, closer. I started to feel restless, feeling a lump in my throat. There was something wrong. With every turn I made, the car seemed to get even closer, as if it was following me closely, not caring about my speed. The strange thing is that, no matter how much I tried to escape, he wasn't overtaking or moving away. It was as if that car was following the same path as me, always behind, always close. My nerves were already on edge. That road was dangerous, with some dark and treacherous parts, and being followed like that made me even more anxious. I didn't know if I was becoming paranoid, but something told me this wasn't normal. After a few more minutes, I couldn't take it anymore. The car kept following me, and the feeling of being watched became unbearable. I was taking tight curves, my heart was already racing, and that car wouldn't leave me alone. I decided I had to stop and confront the driver. Something inside me told me that if I just stopped, I would have answers. So, without thinking much, I stopped the truck on the side of the road, turning off the lights. Immediately, the car also stopped, the light going out. What I expected to see was someone getting out of the car, but nothing happened. I stood there for a few seconds, eyes fixed on the darkness, waiting to see any movement, any sign of life from the car. But nothing. The silence was absolute, and the sound of the wind in the mountains seemed almost deafening. I didn't know what to expect. The feeling of being watched increased with every second. The car was there, stopped, but it seemed so empty, as if its presence was just an illusion. I took a deep breath, trying to control the growing panic, and finally decided to get out of the truck. It didn't make sense, but I needed to know what was going on. I stepped out of the cab, the light from my truck illuminating the deserted road in front of me. The air was cold and sharp, and every sound I made seemed to echo in the night. I looked at the car parked behind me, waiting for the driver to get out or call me, but what left me even more disconcerted was the fact that, even with the truck's headlights illuminating the area, I couldn't see anyone inside the vehicle. The windows were fogged up, but the car looked like it was empty. I didn't know what to do. Should I go closer, knock on the window? I stood there, looking at the car, waiting for a reaction. That's when, suddenly, the car disappeared. There was no sound, no movement. He just disappeared. I blinked a few times, trying to understand what had happened, but the car was no longer there. The road was empty, silent. I looked everywhere, trying to find some clue, some sign that the car had left, but there was nothing. I approached the spot where the car was parked, but, inexplicably, there were no tire tracks on the road. There was no sign that the vehicle had moved. The only thing left was my own rapid breathing and the emptiness around me. I stood there for a long time, trying to process what had just happened. How did the car disappear like that, without leaving any trace? I walked a little along the road, looked around, but there was no one. No sign, no indication of who was there before. The feeling of being followed was still with me, but now it was stronger, more oppressive. As if the entire road was watching me. I got back into the truck with my heart still racing, and as I started the engine, the road in front of me seemed darker than ever. The feeling that something was wrong continued, but no matter what I did, I couldn't understand what had happened. I just knew that, somehow, I was still being followed. I continued driving down the road, trying to stay calm, but my mind was in a whirlwind. The car that followed me, the inexplicable disappearance, everything seemed to mix together in a confusion of fears and unanswered questions. Each curve seemed tighter, the road darker, and the rearview mirror, which had previously seemed empty, now seemed like a window to something I didn't want to see. I forced myself to look ahead, but the feeling that something was there, watching me, didn't go away. With each kilometer covered, the fear intensified. I didn't know if it was paranoia or if something really strange was happening, but the feeling of being followed, of no longer being alone, seemed to stick with me. The road was still empty, with no other car in sight, but the anguish was relentless. I didn't know what to do. As if the increasing tension wasn't enough, when I passed a tighter curve, I saw something in the rear view mirror. The light, again. The car was back, right behind me. It wasn't possible. I quickly looked ahead, accelerated the truck, but the car wouldn't move away. He was there, like a persistent shadow, following me closely, as if the path was the same, never overtaking me, never stopping. Desperately, I braked suddenly, hoping the car would stop too, but when I looked back, the road was empty again. The car disappeared like a mirage, leaving only the echo of silence behind me. I looked for a few more minutes, eyes fixed on the rearview mirror, trying to find any trace, any sign that I was being followed, but there was nothing. I was alone, or at least, I seemed to be. Panic gripped me, and I realized my mind was beginning to give in to madness. What the hell was going on there? I sped up, and didn't stop until I found the next town. I knew I couldn't stay on that road any longer. When I finally entered the gas station, I took a deep breath, trying to calm down. The attendant looked at me curiously, but I couldn't explain what had happened. The fear was still in me, a constant presence that told me something wasn't right. I tried to forget, to try to move on, but to this day, every time I travel those mountain roads, I look in the rearview mirror and wonder if I'll ever see that car again. Sometimes I swear I hear the sound of the engine approaching. It was a cold, dark night when I was crossing a deserted road in the mountains, quite late. My truck's headlights only illuminated a small part of the road, and the rest seemed to be swallowed up by the thick fog that had suddenly formed. It wasn't the first time I'd taken that route, but that night the road felt different, as if something was in the air. I was already tired, but the noise of the engine and the solitude of the road gave me a strange feeling of tranquility. That's when I realized another truck was in front of me. At first I thought it was just a driver taking the same route, but something didn't feel right. The truck in front of me was big, bigger than mine, and its cargo seemed to be well loaded. What bothered me was that no matter how hard I tried to see through the fog, the driver was not visible. There was no one in the cabin. It gave me a chill, but then again, it could have been some kind of reflection or just the fog playing tricks on me. However, as I tried to catch up to the truck, I noticed that it was moving away quickly, as if it was going faster than it should. Instinctively, I accelerated. I wanted to understand what was happening. The truck in front of me continued at the same speed, but when I looked in the rear-view mirror, I noticed that the distance between us was decreasing. I was closer, but what made me even more uneasy was the fact that at every turn, the truck seemed to disappear into a thick curtain of fog, as if it were dissolving into the road. I sped up even more, not being able to believe what my eyes were seeing. The sound of the truck's engine, even from a distance, seemed unmistakable, but as I got closer, the noise began to blend with the fog, creating a feeling of disconnection. Suddenly, without any explanation, the truck completely disappeared. It wasn't a curve where he disappeared, it wasn't a stop. It simply fell apart, as if it had never existed. I stopped for a moment, perplexed, trying to understand what had happened. The sound of the engine continued to echo, but now, it seemed distant, as if it were coming from somewhere far beyond the fog. I looked everywhere, trying to find some sign, some trace of the truck, but there was nothing. The road was empty. As if that truck had been a mirage. I continued driving, but the feeling of déjà vu accompanied me, as if it had happened before. The feeling of déjà vu wouldn't leave me alone. The road, the fog, the sound of the engine, everything seemed so familiar, as if I had already experienced it before. I looked in the rearview mirror several times, hoping to see the truck reappear, but there was nothing. The silence that followed was profound, thicker than the fog itself. I didn't know if I was starting to get paranoid or if something really strange had happened. Worst of all was the feeling that I was stuck in a loop, as if I had been through that exact moment before. Time didn't seem to move straight, and the road before me seemed to stretch forever. I kept driving, trying to push the thought out of my head, but the fog just grew thicker and thicker until I could barely see the road ahead. The truck no longer appeared, and when I looked around, the trees and the ground became diffuse shadows in the mist. The truck's engine roared softly, almost as if it was trying to calm me down, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was following me, that this road wasn't the same as before. The images, the sensations, the smell of the air, everything seemed strange and at the same time familiar, as if I had experienced it all before, somewhere, at some time. Suddenly, the sound of a truck engine echoed behind me, and I looked in the rear-view mirror. It couldn't be. It couldn't be the same truck. But there he was, emerging from the fog. But this time, what left me even more confused was that the truck seemed to be following exactly my speed, without overtaking, without getting any closer. It was the same truck, or at least, it was the same truck. The headlights seemed brighter now, illuminating the road and the fog around me, but there was no one in the cabin, as before. The feeling that I was reliving something, that it had already happened, became even stronger. I stopped again, but this time, more abruptly. The truck behind me followed the same trajectory, stopping in front of me, exactly as the other one had done. I got out of the truck with my heart racing, trying to understand what was happening, and when I looked at the cabin, again, it was empty. There was no one. But the most disturbing thing was that I no longer knew what was real and what wasn't. I looked around, but the road was deserted, the fog too thick to see anything further than a few meters in front of me. The sound of the engine was still there, but it seemed more and more distant, as if the truck was moving away from me even though I knew there was nowhere to go. The truck, or whatever it was, simply disappeared once again. I stood there, in the middle of the road, my heart beating in my chest as if it wanted to get out. The sound of the truck's engine disappeared again, as if it had never existed, and the road became completely silent again. I was alone. Or at least, it seemed to be. The fog, which had previously seemed thick and threatening, now seemed to swallow the road into an endless abyss. I looked ahead, and all I saw was the road stretching away without any sign of life, without any movement. The truck was no longer there. No sound, no light. Just emptiness. I climbed back into my truck and started driving, not knowing exactly why. There was something about that place, something about that road, that I couldn't understand. I was beginning to wonder if I was losing my sanity. How could it be possible? How did that truck appear, disappear and then reappear, all in such a thick fog? I accelerated, aimlessly, trying to get out of that nightmare, but the road seemed to be stretching without end. No matter how hard I drove, the fog didn't dissipate. I was stuck there, somewhere I couldn't identify. And then, for the last time, I looked in the rear-view mirror. And there was the truck again, distant, but following me, without overtaking, without disappearing. I could no longer distinguish what was real and what wasn't. I looked ahead once more, and for a brief moment, the road seemed to curve, disappear into the horizon, and I knew something was out of control. But what terrified me most was the thought that I might never get out of there. Maybe that road, that night, was a place where time distorted, and I was trapped forever, in an infinite loop. I didn't look back again. I was driving alone down an isolated road in rural Virginia on a moonless night when I began to notice a strange figure on the side of the road. At first, I thought it was just someone lost or a truck driver in trouble, but as I got closer, the figure didn't seem to move, it just stood there, still, as if it was waiting for something. The strangeness of that scenario bothered me immediately. I was used to long journeys, but I had never seen anyone there, especially at that time of night. As I got closer, I realized that the figure was, in fact, a person, or at least, it appeared to be. But, when I looked closer, I noticed that she didn't have any kind of human characteristics. There was no definition in its shape, it seemed distorted, like a shadow that stretched as the light from the lighthouse illuminated it more. I slowed down, trying to understand what was happening, but what happened next made me freeze. Suddenly, the figure quickly moved in front of my truck, almost as if it was taunting me, as if it was waiting to be run over. The movement was so fast and so strange that I almost couldn't react. I blinked my eyes, and before I could process what was happening, I walked past her. However, what I saw in the rearview mirror made me stop the truck immediately. The figure, or the thing, was not human. Its contours were indescribable, as if beyond any logic I could understand. It was huge, much bigger than anyone. The proportions were all wrong. What appeared to be a human silhouette transformed into something monstrous as I passed by it. I couldn't even describe it properly, but it was as if it were a mixture of shadows and shapes that didn't fit together, something that couldn't exist in the real world. I didn't know what to do. I knew I shouldn't continue, but at the same time, a part of me wanted to understand what that thing was. I turned around and went back to where the creature was. What I found left me even more disturbed. There was nothing there. The road was empty, but a trail of mysterious footprints began to appear in the dirt beside the road. The footprints were huge, so big that my stomach turned just looking at them. I stopped the truck, got out and tried to follow the footprints. They took me into the forest, but after a few meters, the trail simply disappeared. There was nothing else. I went back to the truck, but the feeling that something was still watching me didn't leave me alone. I stood there for a few minutes, looking at the forest in front of me, trying to understand what was happening. The wind blew through the trees, creating sounds that only heightened the feeling that something was out of place. The trail of footprints disappeared into the darkness, as if swallowed by the earth, and all I could hear was the sound of my heavy breathing. I didn't know if I had seen that or if I was starting to go crazy from being on the road so much. I had to be seeing things. But what if it wasn't? The fear that settled in the back of my mind wouldn't leave me alone. I looked in the rearview mirror once more, hoping to see some sign of that thing, but there was nothing. The road was empty. The night was silent, almost stuffy. I tried to move on, but I couldn't. Something was pulling me towards that forest, something that told me that the creature was still there, hidden in the shadows. I knew I should continue my journey, continue my work, but I couldn't get the scene out of my head. With a sigh, I turned around, walked back to where the footprints disappeared, and climbed out of the truck. I didn't know what I was looking for, but something told me I had to understand. The trees were thick around me, the shadows made thicker by the darkness. I entered the forest, even though I knew it was a mistake, but the fear of not knowing what that thing was consumed me. I had to see it with my own eyes. I spent a few minutes walking through the trees, but everything felt wrong. The air was heavy, like it was thick with something I couldn't explain. There were no sounds of nature around me, as if the entire world had gone silent. I started to wonder if this was all just happening in my head. Then, as I looked at the ground, I saw something that made me stop instantly, new, fresher footprints, still visible in the damp earth. But this time, the footprints were even bigger, deeper, as if the creature had become even more immense, and they seemed to follow me. Panic took over me, and I felt a sense that I was no longer alone there. That's when I heard a sound, coming from inside the forest. Something moved between the trees, something big. The noise was muffled, but it was impossible not to hear it. The sound seemed to get closer, and the fear intensified, chilling my blood. I took a step back, ready to run back to the truck, but before I could do anything, a gigantic shadow appeared in front of me. I couldn't see it completely, but I could feel the size, the overwhelming presence of the thing. I tried to scream, but my throat felt closed, the air was running out of me. All I could do was stand still, waiting for whatever it was. The shadow moved with surprising agility, given its size. I could barely follow her with my eyes, but I could feel her presence, a pressure in the air, as if something colossal was right there, just a few meters away from me. I couldn't process what was happening. The creature, or whatever it was closer now, so close that I could hear the heavy sound of its footsteps, as if the earth was being trampled by something much larger than a human being. Fear took over me so intensely that my body was paralyzed. I didn't know whether to run, hide, or try to scream for help. But at no point did the creature truly become visible. She just existed, a monstrous presence, pushing me to the brink of insanity. I closed my eyes, tried to focus, but when I opened them again, she was gone. There was no more sound, there was no more anything. Silence took over everything, as if the world had returned to normal. But I knew it wasn't normal. I looked around, trying to see any clues, but nothing was there. There were no footprints, no sound, nor any sign that the creature had actually existed. All that was left was the feeling that something had watched me, and the fear that, somehow, I was unable to understand what had really happened. I ran back to the truck, almost tripping over my own feet, my heart beating out of control. I quickly climbed into the cabin, started it and accelerated with all my might, not even wanting to look back. The fear that the creature was still following me was so great that I could barely see the road in front of me. All I wanted was to get out of there. At every turn, every mile, I glanced in the rearview mirror, hoping to see something, anything, but the road was empty, the forest behind me even darker and quieter. I didn't know what had happened that night, but one thing was certain: I would never forget what I saw. Or what I thought I saw. When I got to the nearest town, I stopped at the first gas station and tried to tell them what happened, but no one believed me. They thought I was just exhausted, or that I was seeing things because of the solitude of the roads. I wanted to believe that, but to this day, I can't understand what happened on that isolated road. I just know that every time I pass by there, I feel the same chill and the same feeling of being watched, as if the creature were still there, waiting for me. And the worst part? I don't know if I'll ever really be able to leave that encounter behind.